Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 12th of December 2022, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by David Scott, bringing us northern exposure from north of the border. Apologies for that. And we're also joined by Mark Anderson from the United States.
Okay, we're going to get kicked off with this. This is a reminder that last week we were reporting from the NHS Confederation that health leaders were welcoming this new elective recovery task force, which is all about apparently more outsourcing of NHS services to private companies. So this was the response or the comment from the Department of Health and Social Care that experts would focus on how the NHS can utilise existing capacity in the independent sector to cut the backlog. And of course, this is going to come at no extra cost to the NHS. Now, yesterday, Wes Streeting, who is the Shadow Health Secretary, was on the BBC. Well, he seemed to be agreeing with this policy, which seems unusual for the Labour Party. But anyway, here's what he said.
We already have staff who do a significant amount of work in the private sector. I'm not talking about robbing Peter to pay Paul. I'm talking about dealing with the fact that there are empty beds available in the private sector. And perhaps worse still, we have a two-tier healthcare system in this country today, where those who can pay to go private and are seen faster, and those who can't afford to pay are left lagging behind. And I think that is deeply unfair. I would rather, as a short-term measure, use the private sector to bring down NHS waiting lists faster at no cost to those people who can't afford private healthcare, at the same time as putting the investment we need to make the NHS fit the future. And that's what the last Labour government did.
So, David, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I mean, what we should note, of course, before you comment on this is that, as he said at the beginning of that, he acknowledged at the beginning of that little clip, many of the people that are working for these independent providers are, in fact, already also working for the National Health Service. So it is exactly robbing Peter to pay Paul, in the sense that staff are going to have to come out of the NHS to go and fulfil those tasks in the private sector. So what do you think's going on here?
Well, quite. Another politician saying, well, it's unfair. As Brian pointed out last week, childlike language doesn't really mean anything. Robbing Peter to pay Paul is the entire principle of government, because you can always be assured of the support of Paul. And there is no real analysis here of what the problem is. I spent a fascinating 3 hours on the train heading up from London on Friday with an NHS nurse discussing all of these things. It's not privatisation that's on offer, of course, because privatisation does not involve coercing the people who will use the service to use the service, or at least to pay for it. But that's what the government system does. It's all about choice. What this does is it takes the private sector and it gives it one customer, which is the state, and the people who should be the customers, the patients, they become the product. And that mindset tends to permeate everything. I find this not reassuring.
I just add that last Thursday we put out a very interesting interview with UK Column and a gentleman called Duncan White, who was looking at some of these very points. He's got a lot of experience in the NHS and outside and around the NHS in the care system. And we'll do our best to get that interview up as soon as possible. People can see some of the points that he raised, including some quite surprising revelations about who has been driving policy inside the NHS.
Also last week, Debbie Evans was talking about antibiotic availability and so on. Well, this is the Pharmaceutical Services Negotiating Committee, and they're highlighting the issue of antibiotic availability and the pricing. And this is what they're saying. Wholesale prices of many oral antibiotics have risen significantly owing to the surge in demand. This is as a result of Strep A, for example, and the ongoing supply disruptions affecting these medicines. As the majority of wholesalers are showing as out of stock on most lines, we're also hearing that some suppliers have significantly put their prices up this week for any oral antibiotics they do have in stock. Due to pricing issues affecting several medicines, including antibiotics, PSNC has applied for a record number of price concessions this month. We're very concerned that many contractors who are desperately trying to get hold of limited stock of antibiotics for their patients are paying inflated prices for these medicines without any certainty of their final reimbursement prices. And that's quite an interesting point, because some of the pharmacists are saying that they're losing £30 on every packet of antibiotics that crosses the counter at present, as a result of the fact that they're not getting reimbursement from the NHS for what they're having.
How important it is for all these people who came out, the people who make the videos, the people who made the speeches, one of whom Brian's going to be interviewing in the new year, and people like 5 Times August, Brant Skistimus, who make the music. Everyone's making a contribution, and it's a lovely thing to be part of.
Okay, thanks for that, David. And I would just bring this up on screen. This is Vanessa Beeley's article just published on the UK Column website on the euthanasia programme in Canada. Headline is Canada's expanding euthanasia laws, making the unthinkable thinkable again. So let's just take a couple of quotes from this. In 2016, Canada, with Justin Trudeau's administration in office, passed Bill C4, legalising medical euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, together referred to by Canada public bodies as Medical Assistance in Dying, or MAID. By November 2020, more than 19,000 individuals nearing end of life had been voluntarily euthanized. It goes on to say, in March 2021, the law was amended by Bill C7, which permits assisted euthanasia for patients whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. In 2021, it's estimated that more than 10,000 people were assisted in killing themselves in Canada. And then another quote here, in the case of Amir Farsood, has shocked Canadians into questioning the expansion of assisted dying into the realm of mental health, especially in the current unforgiving economic conditions globally. So, you know, we're seeing the slippery slope here. As I remember a number of years ago, whenever the discussion of euthanasia was being brought up in the UK politics, that, well, don't worry about it, it's only going to be in very specific cases, it's only going to be in the case of somebody who's really at the end of their life, that they're absolutely able to make the decision for themselves and so on. Whereas in Canada, we've seen this law passed over a number of periods of time, over a number of years, and we've seen that initially it was exactly as expressed in the UK, but then they expanded it to include people that maybe had made a decision in the past but were no longer actually considered competent to make a decision now, but they could still be killed. And now they're including people that aren't foreseeing the end of their lives, and now they're including people with mental health issues. And in fact, in that article, there's an instance, and I'm sure there are many more, of someone who was making the choice between being homeless and being dead. And in Canada, this is just going off the charts. In fact, I think I've got that one here. Sorry, I've missed one here. Let's bring that on. The Canadian Federal Expert Panel on the application of MAID for mental illness has recommended mental illness be grafted into the MAID framework. It's just incredible how quickly this is moving and how many people are being killed by it.
It is, Mike. Later in the news, we're talking about another subject where there's been a clear policy operating throughout the whole government structure, swallowing up huge amounts of money. What we've got to do is come back to who were the individuals who created this policy, who were the individuals that enacted the policy. It's not governments doing this ultimately, it's men and women in rooms who are making these decisions, and those individuals need to be identified and held to account. I think this is a fundamental point. But we'll also say that we know for the UK column audience, many of these topics are very challenging, and a lot of people find them difficult subjects to listen to read. But we're reporting reality. This is what is happening in the world and in UK, and if we're to deal with it, we've got to stand up and grip these subjects. Well, let's move on to more death and destruction. Of course, if we have governments that are prepared to carry out euthanasia on its own citizens, war overseas by proxy is no problem at all. We've got a little video clip here, which I'm just using to highlight the style of the war in Ukraine. Much of the fighting is in built-up areas, but in many cases, it's men trying to hide in ditches or in tree lines with a few armoured vehicles that are being taken out very quickly, particularly if there are drones in the air And we can see the horror of this situation where armoured vehicles are destroyed, and you can see the men very clearly on the ground around them. This is happening largely as the result of Russian weapon systems, but Ukraine also operating drones in this way, and men being killed on both sides. But of course, the story which the West is really not sure how to frame concerns Bakhmut, and this is where the bulk of the fighting at the moment in a built-up area is taking place in Ukraine. So the Telegraph with an interesting headline here: inside Bakhmut, the strange and senseless death trap draining Ukraine's tired army. So that's the headline, but if you read the article very quickly, it's spun as though the Ukrainians are mowing down thousands of Russians who are charging in useless attacks against the Ukrainian positions. But in fact, something else is going on. If we can just pop that one on screen. Just want to bring this comment in here. The Telegraph is clearly confused because in the headline it describes what is really happening. It describes a death trap draining Ukraine's tired army. But it's clear when we look at the article itself, the Telegraph can't understand what's happening. If we get into just part of it, and we'll just highlight here, it says some conflict experts say Russians' obsession with the city has become nothing more than a ploy to drain Ukraine's armed forces of their limited resources. So something is going on in this city. The Ukrainians don't want to let Bakhmut go. The Russians are clearly want to take it. But we've got conflict experts who are confused because it appears it's doing nothing more than draining Ukraine's armed forces of their limited resources. Well, of course, amongst the tragedy of the thousands and thousands of Ukrainian killed and wounded, what we've got is the reality that this is the last bastion of defence for Ukraine. If Bakhmut falls, it undermines the whole Ukrainian defensive line. And the Russians are in no hurry to do this because at the moment they are simply drawing in thousands of Ukrainian forces and reinforcements, and they're killing them. And so the Telegraph doesn't want to talk about the reality of what's happening on the ground. We've got to go to social media to actually have a look. And of course, if you look at any area across Ukraine, the first thing you can see is the thousands and thousands of artillery shells. Those artillery shells are creating the deaths. Russia is firing 9-1 in a ratio to the Ukrainians, and yet US, UK, NATO and EU dare not mention the Ukrainian casualties. And the reason, of course, is that those casualties are so high because Ukraine is losing the war. What the West needs to do is stop the war. Let's look at this little clip. We've shown thermite or phosphorus, as some people claim it is. We don't know, but just to show the sheer horror of how troops are being cleared out from tree lines and amongst small built-up areas. Let's have a look at this video clip. Well, that really shows it all, a truly horrible situation. Of course, anybody touched by that falling thermite or phosphorus is going to be extremely badly injured, if not killed. But of course, this is huge areas now being laid to waste. But at the moment, nobody in the West wants to stop the war because the war is good for the ultimate agenda, which is supposedly regime change in Russia. But other reports coming in show that the casualties amongst mercenaries are now increasing. And this is just two individuals, or these are two individuals that I've taken from social media. I'm taking the reports as correct. But it's very interesting that we've now got a female mercenary identified as being recently killed, according to the report. I'm going to put in a question here, which is, why is the BBC not calling for equality to be enforced on the front line with 50-50 male to female fighters on the Ukrainian side? Apparently all of that BBC agenda has gone out of the window. But the tragedy is nobody in the West is calling to stop this war. The agenda is to get more weapons in. And if that's not bad enough, we've now got Britain boasting that it's going to be setting up a new fighter with the support of Italy and Japan. And this apparently, according to Rishi Sunak, is going to help us increase our military intervention capability in the Indo-Pacific regions. So no sign of backtracking on anything other than war is good, and we need more, Mike.
Yes, indeed. Right, David, let's move on to the European Parliament then. Now, I saw a story today, there's a bit of a corruption scandal going on in the European Parliament at the moment.
There is, but that's not what I'm focusing on here. I've got a talk here that was given by a Polish professor of philosophy and historical philosophy and modern politics. So a man who thinks about things. And this was at the 70th anniversary of the European Parliament. And he had some things to say that they didn't want to hear. This speech, only 2 minutes long, is fascinating. The reaction of the parliamentarians, equally fascinating.
Madam President, Prime Ministers, 2 minutes of truth, of bitter truth. And the bitter truth is that the European Parliament has done a lot of damage in Europe. It has been sending a false message. It represents European demos. There isn't, and there won't be, any European demos. The Parliament infected Europe with shameless partisanship. And the infection became so contagious that it spread to other institutions, such as the European Commission. The Parliament has abandoned the basic function of representing people. Instead, it has become a machine to implement the so-called European project, thus alienating millions of voters. The Parliament has become a political vehicle of the left to impose their monopoly with their fierce intolerance towards any dissenting view. No matter how many times you repeat the word diversity, diversity is becoming an extinct species in the European Union, and particularly in this chamber. The Parliament is a quasi-parliament because it rejects the essential principle of parliamentarism, namely accountability. The deputy, let me remind you, is elected by the voters and must be accountable to the voters that elected him. Not so in the European Union. The idea that, say, Spanish, German, French, etc., deputies accountable to their own national electorates can dictate something to, shall we say, a Hungarian society or any other society to which they cannot be held accountable and which cannot take them to task is simply preposterous. Call it what you will, but democracy it is not. To sum up, the Parliament represents the demos that does not exist, works for the project that ignores reality and law, shuns accountability, turns its back on millions of people, and serves the interest of one political orientation. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Having said that, ladies and gentlemen, I rest my case.
So, fascinating comments. A parliament that ignores reality and law. There's no accountability. He could be talking about Holyrood. I mean, goodness, he could almost be talking about Westminster these days. That's historically been the best of the parliaments, and is that not true of Westminster as well? I particularly like some of the shots of the audience, the cognitive dissonance that was visible in their faces. And there was one point, there was two people who were just chatting because they were reacting as though he wasn't there. It was an unexpected intermission. That's how they were responding. They were responding as though he was not speaking at all because they were unable to process what he was saying. A really strange psychological reaction amongst the parliamentarians. But didn't he do well?
He did. Now let's move on to Russian matters. And well, Angela Merkel made a statement over the weekend or a few days ago, which was quite incredible in many ways. We mentioned this on Friday. I think the Minsk agreements, Angela Merkel said, were an attempt to give time to Ukraine. It also used this time to become stronger, as can be seen today. The Ukraine of 2014, 2015 is not the modern Ukraine. So in other words, what she's basically saying here is that they deliberately they set up the Minsk agreements with a deliberate intention of giving Ukraine time to rearm and take on Russia. Now, the Russian response to this, Putin's response to this was quite interesting. So here he is. He said, honestly, this was a complete surprise to me. This is disappointing. Frankly speaking, I did not expect to hear this from the former federal chancellor because I always thought that the leaders of the Federal Republic of Germany were sincere with us. Of course, they were on Ukraine's side and supported Ukraine, but I still thought they'd always been sincerely striving for a settlement. What you have just said only shows that we did everything right by starting the special military operation. Why? Because it transpired that nobody was going to fulfill these Minsk agreements. That's quite an admission from her and quite a response.
It's an incredible admission, but of course it says very clearly nobody can trust Merkel or the EU. So to hear those comments by the gentleman in the EU just says it all. The EU is not to be trusted because it will be working for war while it says it's working for peace.
Indeed. So if the West is working for war, what are the Russians doing in the meantime? Well, here's Dmitry Medvedev, and he's basically saying that they are rearming, but he's saying it's much more difficult for them. The Russians, our enemy has dug in, not only in the Kiev province, but also in Europe, North America, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a whole host of other contemporary Nazi-sworn places, as he describes them. Therefore, he said, we're increasing the production of the most powerful means of destruction, including those based on new principles. So the Russians absolutely getting behind their so-called exotic weaponry that seems to work. In the meantime, Maria Zakharova had this to say, or warned the United States that if the US continues with their threat to provide Ukraine with long-range weapons, that would be a red line as far as as far as Russia would be concerned. I would make the United States a direct party to the conflict, even though the Russians already recognize that in fact they are a direct party to the conflict. The Russians are still stepping back from that position, but this clearly would be a red line for them.
Well, I think this is also prompted by the recent attacks on Russian air bases by the Ukrainians with some very old drones. So the Russians now are putting the red line down. Do they mean it? I would say they do.
Yes.
Because they cannot back down, because of course they're being attacked by virtually the whole of the Western world with the excuse of NATO.
And then the EU was very proud to announce on the 10th, on Saturday, that they have adopted an 18 billion euro assistance package for Ukraine. But when we actually look to see what it is, we find that it's loans with a 10-year grace period, but loans nonetheless. But what grabbed me here, David, was that member states will cover the bulk of the interest costs during this 10-year grace period. Via so-called external assigned revenues. Now, I didn't know what external assigned revenues were, so here's a description of what they are. The EU budget is governed by the principle of universality. This means that there's no direct link between the source of the revenue collected and the expenditure that it finances. So you just get a pot of money and we can spend it as we like. There is an exception to this rule, and that is assigned revenue, meaning specific revenue which is collected to finance specific expenditure. So in this case, the specific expenditure that's being financed is the interest payments on the loans that they're passing to Ukraine with a so-called grace period.
Well, can I speculate that we might be financing, or NATO and the EU might be financing that by using resources robbed from the Russians?
Yeah, it's quite possible, yes. Now let's quickly move on to this, which is the issue of the price cap on Russian oil. And Bloomberg here saying that easy freight helps Russian oil hold above G7's $60 cap in Asia. So basically what has happened is that Russia has found enough ships and insurance capacity to meet the needs for shipping their oil for now, so that some of China's independent refiners are snapping up cargoes of Russian ESPO crude that is set to be delivered in January, and that's according to various traders. Now, ESPO refers to oil produced in eastern Siberia, and it travels along mainly along the Taishet oil transfer station via the 4,200 kilometer eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean pipeline. It ends up at Kosmino port and then is shipped from there. But they seem to be finding enough ships and insurance to now it's not a massive amount above the cap. I think it's $67 or $70 or so, but nonetheless the cap is breached. But here's oilprice.com. Why supertanker rates are suddenly crashing. And this is really interesting. So the situation is, they were talking about the massive price hike in shipping costs. But they're saying that the situation is now reversed with supertanker rates plunging sharply. According to Bloomberg, ships capable of holding 2 million barrels of crude oil are now earning about $38,000 a day, down 62% from just weeks ago, after OPEC Plus cut production and reduced releases from US reserves lowered some seaborne volumes. Now, of course, the OPEC Plus production cut was directly caused by the $60 price cap and the response to that. So what we're saying is that as soon as that price cap was imposed, the cost of shipping collapsed because there are too many ships available. But then we've got this from the Economic Times. Russia offers India help in leasing and building large capacity ships to overcome the G7's oil price cap. And what they're saying is that Russia has welcomed India's decision to not support the price cap on Russian oil announced by the G7 and its allies, and has offered it cooperation in leasing and building large capacity ships to overcome the ban on insurance services and tanker chartering in the European Union and Britain. So there is resistance to this G7 move in various parts of the world. Well, what can we say? Their attempt to impose a price cap doesn't seem to be working. David, you've got other economic news.
Well, we showed this last week. This is M2, the chart for M2 that shows the vast increase in the money supply over the COVID lockdown and the continuation of that thereafter, which prompted the very rapid inflation. That is inflation of the money supply. It prompted the very rapid increase in prices everywhere. And we were highlighting the fact that the Fed's intervention had actually managed to make that tick down very slightly, and they were actually managing to slightly contract the money supply, and we're talking about the likelihood of things breaking. This prompted a viewer to provide some more information via Alex Thompson's Telegram channel. And a very interesting chart here, again from the St. Louis Fed, from the Fed's website. And it shows two lines here. Now, the red line is essentially all commercial bank deposits. So this is the historical inflation by the commercial banks via the creation of money as against debt instruments. So they're creating money to lend out, and that's secured against debt instruments, and there's a long-term, actually surprisingly steady inflation in the money supply. And it doesn't even change much during the financial crisis of 2008-2009 until very recently. Now, the blue line here is essentially what the Fed is doing with its money supply and its total liabilities. All right, so these two things are operating separately until something very interesting happens in the repo crisis in 2019. So this is before COVID. The two went into lockstep. So it now seems that it's no longer the commercial banks inflating the money via debt that's actually driving the money supply. It's all now the central banks. Something has broken in the economy. The thing that was broken was a bit broken itself. I mean, there's fractional reserve banking, we've talked a lot about the problems, but the point this chart makes is from 2019 onwards, even that broken system has failed to operate, and we're now operating an even more broken system where a few people in a few rooms in a few capital cities are deciding exactly what happens to the money supply, and it's on their wisdom that the entire world economy depends. And of course,
David,
this will go badly.
David, is that something broken, or is that normalization in preparation for central bank digital currency
And control.
Well,
just a question.
I actually don't have a quick answer to that. I think it's something new, and I think it's something that does warrant us to explore and discuss it at length now and in the coming months. I don't want to give you a glib answer to that because it's too likely to be wrong. I would simply say this is new. It's never happened before, and the implications of it will be profound, I suspect. And it's things that no one has yet really addressed because it's never happened in the history of humanity until 2019 repo crisis.
Yeah, okay. And what's going on with interest rates for the Bank of England then?
Well, now, remember, if you cast your mind back to, 2 weeks ago, everyone knew what was happening. We're going to raise interest rates. We're going to keep raising them. We're going to conquer inflation. We're absolutely determined. There's no change. We're not even thinking about a change. Don't suggest there's going to be a switch in our policy. Everything's determined. Well, not anymore. So there's now a four-way split on what to do with interest rates, and we seem to be talking about, well, we might put them up by 0.5%, we might put them up by 0.75%, we might not. There's lots of different ideas floating around the Bank of England. Nobody knows. Now, one of the reasons nobody knows is what they've done is they've put interest rates up from zero, and it was the zero interest rates, the free money was supporting asset price bubbles all over the economy, dislocations all over the economy, and it was inflating asset prices to the moon. As they started to put the interest rates somewhere halfway back towards normal, let alone high enough to actually tackle the inflation, they of course started to crash the asset price bubbles. And here we see the Guardian of all newspapers, bemoaning, that the UK homes have come down 2.1% in value in a month, 2.1% of an average price of 360,000 It's quite a lot of money. So people might work out how much they've lost in the last month and consider whether they should be buying any houses in the near future. And we've got here Mortgage Solutions talking about the same thing. Now, the bank rate is to fall. Now, we're raising bank rates. I want you to remember we're raising bank rates because we're going to conquer inflation, because that's our goal. Okay, we're not having any turning. But the Mortgage Solutions and Capital Economics are reporting that in 2024 bank rates are going to come down more quickly than expected, because by then we'll have solved all the problems, obviously, and they'll basically have to pull the interest rates back down in order to stimulate the economy. So the pivot's already being discussed. All that remains to be seen is the date. And they're talking, Capital Economics said, a 12% fall in house prices. 12% of 360,000 is how much? 12% fall in house prices next year will dent consumer confidence. That is understatement of the year. Good British understatement, but there we go. And just to give you a small smile, I hope, at the end of this economic section, which doesn't have many smiles in it, we have here a father reading to his son, and he's reading from a book entitled The National Debt and What You Owe for Babies. And if you look on the look on the baby's face of a mixture of horror and shock, that baby's figuring out exactly what the situation is with regards to debt that the government's still building up for him to pay, as they support everything while we pretend we don't have real problems and we don't address any of them.
Yes.
Well, the baby can sort it out, but apparently the government can't. Just pop this one on screen briefly. It's a Conservative Way Forward. It's a document from June this year. It's written by a gentleman called Julian Jessup, a charter for tax cuts. But what's interesting in this document is, alongside his argument for tax cuts, he's talking about we're already paying too much in debt interest. So we can say that at least part of the problem is that at the moment nobody seems to know who is actually controlling the money supply system. So a lot more work to be done.
Okay, if you like what the UK Column does, you would like to support us, please head over to community.ukcolumn.org and there are options for you to help us out there. You could pick something up at UK Column Shop. We've got to say that at this point we can't guarantee delivery for Christmas. There's obviously a postal strike ongoing and there are other strike days coming up, but we believe the backlog within the postal sorting offices is so huge that it's going to be unlikely to be cleared by Christmas 2023, never mind Christmas 2022. So please do pick something up if you don't mind the risk. But also please share any material you find on the various platforms. I just want to say a very quick thank you to everybody that took part in the Doctors for COVID Ethics Symposium on Saturday. It was a great event. We'll have it up on the UK Column website, hopefully later today, as soon as possible.
And of course, well done to you, Mike, because you spent a whole day in the studio to make that happen for viewers and listeners. So well done. It was really good. I just picked up in particular on this gentleman, Philip Cruz, who was talking about the legal case in Switzerland. And I thought that it was wonderful how clearly now people are beginning to pull apart the official narrative. So this was a summary of all evidence, which shows an intent to harm. That's the case being put forward. And look at the little subheadings: toxic by design, no safety, no efficacy, bad manufacturing, malignant policy worldwide. And that was just part of the evidence put forward. If you want to see more on that particular criminal complaint against Swiss Medic, you can go to the web address on screen now.
And David, just a reminder of a couple of Scottish events. Well, one Scottish event and one UK Column event.
Yes, so the Fonethi conference is arranged for Sunday, 22nd of January. We're still having to talk to the ladies on whose behalf we're arranging this to get some of the details worked out, but we will be back to advertise that in more detail shortly. We're also hoping that Brian Gerrish will be joining us in Scotland that weekend, and we're looking to organise an event, a UK Column event, on the Tuesday following. That'll be the 24th, and more details on that to follow. But if you want to come along and have a chat with Brian, heckle Brian, complain to Brian, or give him a big hug. All of these things are possible. And we've also got an event this Thursday on the 15th, 4:30 to around 9:30. This is a seminar on education, not indoctrination. We have 7 excellent speakers. More details on that we'll put out later today, and including joining instructions. Mike, if you can maybe give us a little outlines how people will join that event, how they'll view it.
Just as far as the UK Column website is concerned, ukcolumn.org/live, and for the members, community.ukcolumn.org/live, and you'll be able to watch it there, and then we'll have the archive of it up as soon as possible afterwards.
And I'll just
Lovely.
add,
Thank you very much.
I'll just add, David, if you'd like me north of the border, you better get the thermostat turned up before I come over the. Before I come over.
It's called Woolly Knickers, Brian, and they will be provided.
Okay.
Right, okay. We'll see about that. Now, on Friday's Extra, Vanessa covered the issue of sanctions in Syria and really was appealing for everybody to get involved in helping to lift those. This is on the front page of the UK Column at the moment, the excerpt from Friday's Extra. We want that shared as far and wide as possible, please, and encourage everybody to get involved. It is just incredible how serious things are for people in Syria at the moment, while everybody's talking about Ukraine and forgetting that sanctions have been on that country for 11 years now. They're not being lifted, and at the moment the average Syrian has electricity for 1 hour per day, and the cost of heating is at least double the average salary, so it's basically unaffordable.
Yeah.
Right, let's finally bring Mark Anderson onto the programme. Welcome to the programme, Mark, and we're going to be talking the global cities, because the global cities movement appears to have a bit of new momentum.
Oh, it certainly does. Not only new momentum, but kind of a new approach. To briefly recap recent history, I started covering this in 2015, 2016. It's one of my main issues that I cover. And at that time, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, the Chicago's version of the CFR, was just having one meeting a year, the Forum on Global Cities. Then the influential Pritzker family got involved. Now it's called the Pritzker Forum on Global Cities. They're a noted family where Pritzker is the governor of Illinois. And now what they're doing is they're spreading this out among NGOs and philanthropies and the scientific community, academia, et cetera, and kind of having a multi-pronged approach throughout the entire year. Various articles, projects, many small webinars, different things like that, as opposed to one big event. And a lot of it is based on, and I'll talk more about this later, what's called world society theory. Now, this is a fairly new term that's come up in the lexicon of the global cities movement. And world society theory, get this, this is important, is a theory of transnational interaction and global social change that emphasizes the importance of global institutions and culture in shaping the structure and behavior of individuals, organizations, and nation states around the world. So nation states, individuals, and organizations are being shaped by world society theory that these different entities are engaging in. So they're really trying to get this behavioral modification going about climate change, just like they've done about COVID and so many other bellwether issues. And what you're showing here is the one of several postings at the council's website, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Better City Network data empowers climate action from below. Moving on, there's an explanation. Cities are key factors in the fight against climate change. Progress made in data collection on city involvement in global governments is crucial to their success. As the annual United Nations Climate Change as the annual United Nations Climate Change Summit winds down in Egypt, amid shortcomings of multilateral diplomatic action and calls to attend to a deepening global environmental catastrophe, a group of international actors stands out again as against the grain: cities. The impact of cities in fighting climate change is becoming more visible and ever better documented as local leaders progressively step up their commitment to tackling one of the planet's deepest crises. Crucial to this story is progress over the past decade made in data collection on city involvement in global governance. And again, based on world society theory, where nation states are not in control but are being modified. And this is the basic rationale we're seeing here for the global cities worldview. I may not read all of these, we'll see. Cities are home, and again, the rationale why they want cities involved. Cities are home to over half the world's population, generate 2/3 of its economic output, and emit 3/4 of so-called global greenhouse gas emissions. Number two, urban areas in low and middle income countries are expanding and driving the world economy and job creation. Three, cities are a pivotal opportunity for a rapid transition, get that, into a sustainable low energy intensity development. Next, low carbon, climate resilient urbanization can limit unsustainable and inequitable development trajectories. Boy, talk about globalese language here. And winding up on this one, cities can accelerate and deepen climate action towards climate resilient development in the next few decades. The opportunity for effective, efficient, and rapid action in cities depends on accessible, actionable science at the city scale. You see, so the nation state is being elbowed out here, and I can elaborate on that theme more. Do you guys have any comments at this point or questions?
Well, I'd say straight away, Mark, that I've got a section in the news coming up, and this dovetails in with it perfectly. As we often say to our audience, this is the first time I'm seeing your report on this subject. So let's see how this will, as I say, dovetail a little bit later in the news. Very interesting.
Yeah, as we address this next slide here, I'll read a preliminary thing. The past 3 decades have seen the formation, and this is important too, of transnational municipal networks, or TMNs, or organized coalitions of local governments, you might call them, that enable cities to improve their individual capacity to address global challenges such as climate change. And these networks improve the capacity of member cities to decarbonize by providing greenhouse gas inventorying, software, and model climate policies. They do so in many diverse modes, from independently bridging across state borders as transnational municipal networks, but also as coalitions, either stated by multilateral organizations or philanthropies. So that was an outgrowth of what we've already seen so far. And what we're seeing here really is kind of an unlawful governance. Loose associations, philanthropies, NGOs are basically governing on their own. They're going into autopilot, it appears, at least in a preliminary sense. Now, addressing the slide on the screen, they get even more explicit here. This is from the University of California Press, Toward Global Urban Climate Mitigation, Linking National and Polycentric Systems of Environmental Change. And it goes on to say, as we move on, most research on global environmental change focuses on the national level, but the increasingly significant role of cities worldwide in climate change governance necessitates a global scale understanding of urban environmental change. Moving on, this study explains how greenhouse gas emissions reduction in 330 cities across 48 countries is affected by diffusion of normative expertise and political economic forces, specifically polycentric systems comprised of environmental management consultancies and environmental transnational municipal networks, there we are, facilitate expertise transmission to cities, facilitating urban emissions reductions. Boy, the globalese is thick here. This expertise is diffused globally, this is important, in a normative process explicable by world society theory, there it is, but these polycentric systems bypass national governments in a direct global to local transmission of expertise. There's the key part. These findings advance world society theory, there it is again, beyond its traditional nation-state centric purview. You see, so the nation state is really being driven to the margins, and they've never been this explicit before. Do you guys have any comments at this point?
I think David is interesting in some comment here. This is fascinating, Mark. Excellent analysis.
I'm watching this locally in Scotland. So you're talking.
This is not my opinion. Sorry, go ahead, David.
You're talking about you've picked this up from American think tank, American families pushing this on a global scale. I'm seeing it in Scotland working out. Right, so we've just had this big move by the city of Edinburgh. It's all about 20-minute cities. It's all about keeping people from travelling and all the rest of it. They had a consultation with the people of Edinburgh. Right? They didn't tell the people of Edinburgh this was an international policy and the end point was actually already fixed. They called the consultation Choices. That was the name they picked, Choices. So this is to fool the people into believing it's somehow coming from the locale. It's nothing of the sort. It's coming from on high. It's coming from an international movement here. And it's simply branded in a deceptive way locally, but the rollout is full and detailed, and it covers everything you've just described.
Yeah, fascinating. And I think, and may lightning strike me if I'm wrong, I believe this is called the Delphi theory, where you give people the notion that they're making choices that have already been made for them. And the fix is already in, and you simply go through the motions to make it look like they're involved and make it look like they're choosing something. I believe that's called the Delphi theory, the Delphi approach. And it's been fine-tuned to a fine art. Now, moving on, this is sort of the other leg in the stool so far, and I'll have more next week on the Global Cities Movement with regards to COVID and related matters. It was too much today to cover that and this. But this is the Summary for Urban Policymakers, or SUP, like what's up, right? Sup. Kind of a humorous twist on it. What's up, right? The Summary for Urban Policymakers of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report Series was launched at COP27. And there's an explanation here that follows. What is the Summary for Urban Policymakers about? Basically, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, which is UN stuff, brings out periodic reports based on the latest and most comprehensive scientific assessment of climate change. Really. The initial volume of the Summary for Urban Policymakers series was released in November 2018, so this is 4 or 5 years old, at COP23, and distilled the findings from IPCC Special Report on 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay. The SUP initiative is a series of 3 summary projects, and they've written 3 reports. SUP Volume 1, What's the Latest Physical Science of Climate Change Means for Cities and Urban Areas, distilled from the IPCC Working Group 1 report. SUP Volume 2, What the Latest Science on Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability Means for Cities and Urban Areas, again distilled from IPCC Workings. SUP Volume 3, What the Latest Science is on Climate Change Mitigation and what that means for cities. SUP reports are authored, they say, by the world's leading climate scientists, a selection of the same individuals who have produced the IPCC reports. I guess that's supposed to be reassuring. Who have volunteered, oh, how nice of them, to support this effort in their individual capacities, working in consultation with city, local, and regional governments, cities and city networks, and businesses. No mention of nation states there either. And I believe there's also a video in the works. There's one other thing here, SUP Volume 1. It describes Volume 1 out of those 3 volumes a little more closely. I probably don't need to read this real in detail, but this one says, SUP Volume 1 offers a concise and accessible synthesis of IPCC Working Group 1 material for urban policymakers. Human-induced climate change is affecting every region of the world and cities and urban areas therein. Without deep reductions in emissions, warming will exceed 1.5 Celsius and 2.0 Celsius, exposing in the near term many cities and urban areas to drought, floods, extreme heat, storm surges, and cyclones. In the longer term, many cities and urban areas will also experience sea level rises and other major hydrological challenges, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a little bit of the fear porn. There could be elements of truth in that, but they're so narrowly gauged on what they think causes climate change and global warming, if the global warming is even man-made at all. They're so narrowly gauged that it's very difficult rather to tell where they're accurate, maybe in individual instances, and where they're not. But there's a video here that I believe is on tap that really kind of puts the capstone on where they're going with this.
Climate change impacts are being felt by everyone, everywhere. With rapid urbanization, cities in particular are already becoming sites of human distress. Cities are home to over half the world's population, generate 2/3 of its economic output, and emit 3/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Cities are also a pivotal opportunity for a rapid transition into a sustainable, low-energy intensity development. Cities can and must accelerate and deepen climate action towards climate-resilient and equitable development in the next few decades. The Summary for Urban Policy Makers initiative responds to this pressing need by bringing the world's leading climate scientists in conversation with local government policy makers and businesses in every region of the world. The SUP distills the latest science from the IPCC Assessment Report 6. Since its launch at COP26, through convenings held across the globe, the SUP collaboration identified implementable climate solutions and difficult choices that cities, citizens, businesses, and national governments have to make. Together, we co-produced the Summary for Urban Policy Makers series. Together, we will continue to work towards climate action that can accelerate solutions, respond to individual and collective challenges, work towards leaving no one behind, and urgently respond to the truth that our climate is our future.
Brilliant.
Well, excellent report from Mark, and obviously that's the policy. I'll just add that policy couldn't happen, couldn't be enacted without vast amounts of money.
Right, now look, let's just talk about the latest Twitter releases so far, the Twitter files. This is number 2, and Barry Weiss was pushing this out on Thursday last week. A new Twitter files investigation reveals that the teams of Twitter employees build blacklists, prevent disfavored tweets from trending, and actively limit the visibility of entire accounts or even trending topics, all in secret without informing users. We're talking about this on Friday a little bit, but I just wanted to show a couple of the tweets from this thread, because here's an example. Take, for example, Stanford's Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who argued that COVID lockdowns would harm children. Twitter secretly placed him on a trends blacklist, which prevented his tweets from trending. So he was still able to tweet, but nobody could see it. Or consider the popular right-wing talk show host Dan Bongino, yes, who at one point was slapped with a search blacklist, so nobody could search for him. And then Twitter set the account of conservative activist Charlie Kirk to do not amplify. There's been a lot of criticism of Twitter for doing this, of course, and a lot of people suggesting that Elon Musk is riding to the rescue. But let's just remember what Elon Musk tweeted out on November the 18th, that the new Twitter policy is freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. So I have to admit, I'm struggling to see how Elon Musk's current policy is any different from what came out from the Twitter files number 2. I would also make the point that this is the core principle of the online safety bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment. The idea is that the government is able to say, we're protecting freedom of speech. There's no problem about freedom of speech because everybody will be able to say what they want on the internet, but they're absolutely clear that nobody has the right to be heard. They can say it, but they can't be heard, and the way that you can't be heard is through these types of blacklists, and so on. So I'm not quite so positive as maybe Patrick was on Friday about
where it's going.
Where this is going. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's clear to me that they do not want ordinary people to talk about what they see. If you're using your brain, they don't want you discussing your observations with other people. I've talked about big sums of money being needed in order to get policy in place. Let's have a look at these headlines, which were sent in by a UK column viewer. So the Telegraph here, Jeremy Hunt faces Tory rebellion over 7 billion government spending on woke projects. And the Telegraph was here, but the Sun was also in on this. Woke waste, 7 billion of taxpayers' money splurged on woke roles and activities, damning dossier reveals. Woke and broke. Jeremy Hunt faces Tory revolt as bombshell report reveals 7 billion of taxpayers' cash is wasted on woke projects. Now, initially, when I saw this headline, I found it difficult to grasp how the sum could be 7 billion, because you think about projects, you're not thinking about that scale. But this is the document. If we bring it up on screen, this is from Conservative Way Forward. It's just been published. You can see it on their website. Defunding politically motivated campaigns. And if we bring in the introduction, well, we just have a look at the key bit here. This report, compiled and investigated over a period of months, details over 7 billion worth of savings that are to be had by the British taxpayer if the government stops funding the politically motivated campaigns that are dividing us and making us poorer. So very interesting that they've really got stuck into this subject. Here's some of the detail. Section 1 of the report concerns equality, diversity and inclusivity, EDI. What are we looking at? Cost to the UK taxpayer, 557 million.
A year?
That's a year, yeah. Looks at government grants to charities, a total of 778 million a year to charities. Okay. Section 3 examines EDI-related public procurement contracts, and we're talking about 212 million every year. Section 4 details the largest part of the investigation, Quangos, 5.49 billion every year. These items are costing the taxpayer over 19 million every single day. And it goes on here to talk about freedom of information requests, 6,000 of them put into public authorities. So some of them central government departments, some devolved local councils, universities, schools, health boards, armed forces. So it really does appear that they've done their homework in this. And if we go through the document very quickly, people can, as I say, go and see it in detail for themselves. We've got ending the, it's talking about, it's talking about a total of 427 million in this section here. This one here, 397 local councils across UK. On average, every council employs 2 full-time staff members and has an annual expenditure of 67,000, so that's multiplied across the councils. There's detail in each of these various cities, and they identify certain councils. Bradford City Council, representing the 13th most deprived area in the UK, and that's got a number of these roles, 125 at a cost of 665,000.
And this is to actively promote these types of woke agendas?
Yeah, and we'll show a little bit of this in a moment. I'm going to do this as quickly as I can. We'll come back to it another day. But universities are included here. So they go through a lot of these sections. I've just taken these out as an example for our audience, but here's police forces, almost 5 EDI staff members for every police force, costing the taxpayer 10 million a year. Whitehall departments, 12 million a year. 150 million a year here when you consider British productivity as a whole, where we're losing days by putting people on these equality, diversity and inclusivity training courses. A lot of money disappearing out. They give case studies of where they've investigated charities, and this one is particularly interesting. It says, however, charities are directing more and more resources towards politically motivated campaigns which offer no productive value to the taxpayer and which create unnecessary division and toxicity in our political discourse.
I thought it was illegal for charities to pursue a political agenda.
Well, I'm going to use a stronger word a little bit later, but this is part of what they looked at here. Between 2017 and 2021, the government has handed 203 million to charities that have vocally and vociferously criticised the government's plan to process illegal immigrants in Rwanda. 203 million. This is only part of what this document's talking about. And this goes on to talk about the huge procurement contracts going out. 30 million by NHS England, 10 million NHS Confederation, 9.4 million DEFRA, 800,000 General Medical Council. This is all for EDI training, which is not really going to help anybody at all. More details here when we're looking at local authorities. 500,000 disappeared, 227,000 disappeared in these sorts of courses. So vast amounts of money. And Quangos are also in there, and they say they're responsible for handling 265 billion of money associated with this sort of training every year. Higher education is involved. And we've got advanced higher education receives 14 million in public money from universities procuring its services. Now, there was a quote from this lady, Michelle Donnellan, the former education secretary. She said she's describing the scheme as a dangerous initiative that undermines scholarship, divides our society, and undermines the global standing of our university system. And I think now we're homing in on what this is really about. But have a look at the Arts Council of England, which parade themselves of upstanding in what they do for the culture of this country. 642 million they're swallowing up at the moment. And here it's talking about 196 organisations that they're involved in can be identified as politically motivated. Even High Speed 2 is spending huge amounts of money on EDI because it is influencing every single contractor that is involved with the main contract. If you do a little bit of research on this amazing piece of research, if you go to the BBC, as I did, and I put in 7 billion funding woke agenda, well, I came up with absolutely nothing. And I don't think I'm surprised because, of course, it's the BBC that's a major instigator of this type of training itself. But my criticism of the report is this. There are certain key questions that Conservative Way Forward didn't ask. The first, I think, is which department or departments are responsible for the EDI policy, which ministers are responsible for this policy, which civil servants are responsible for the EDI policy. And when we see this lady making her statement, I think she's underselling what's really happening, because if we're spending this amount of money to destroy the country, we're talking about treason.
Okay, David, any thoughts on that?
No, it was a very good report. We're seeing this everywhere, and it's been very clear for years that it is being funded centrally. It's funded through the government. The attack on our society is state-funded. Right? Now, whether actually identifying who makes the decisions is actually much more difficult, but the funding is very clear. And we've seen, for example, the introduction of the whole LGBT agenda into Aberdeen City Council was one that I looked at, and they just hired an activist. They hired someone whose entire life was pushing this particular political ideology. They put him on salary and gave him the job of teaching the teachers how to teach. And then it permeated through. It wasn't external. and it wasn't individual people being convinced by the argument. It was done centrally by the council, and they put the man on salary. They paid him to do this. So we are, through our taxation system, we are paying for the demise of our own society.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's orchestrated, and as Mark has demonstrated, this is coming from globalist policy. This is nothing to do with national policy in the first instance. And indeed, somebody in our chat box earlier in the news pointed out that the policy which is corrupting the children that the mothers in Wales have been protesting about, ultimately that policy comes back to UN UNESCO policy.
Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time, so we've got a couple of items to push into extra here. But before we go, David, final cartoon.
Final slide. It's a slightly older one. I think it's a Far Side one. And Rudolph's sitting enjoying a glass of wine, and the text says, "All of the other reindeer used to laugh and call him names." And on the wall behind, we've got the mounted heads of Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donna, and Blitzen, and the rifles leaning nonchalantly against the wall. So there you go. Rudolph managed to even the score.
Indeed.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, but we've got a lot more content for extra time. So if you're not somebody who's signed up with UK Column, that's one of the advantages of doing that. You can join us in the extra time. But we're going to say a very big thank you to everybody who's joined us again today. We know it's tough reporting, tough subjects that we're covering. We're going to ask you to stick with it, help us to spread the word about what's really happening. We will be back in a few minutes. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.